Welcome everybody. This is the environmental epidemiology session, and we've got a full program. It's going to be a very interesting one. I'm Alistair Woodward. I'm from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and together with Kai Chen from Yale, we'll be chairing this session. And the format is, as in other sessions, that we've got 5 speakers in the first half who will be presenting their talks, and they've got 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 8 minutes each, and then we'll have question time, and then we'll change over, and there are 4 presentations in the second half, including one by video, and Kai will be chairing that session. So let's get underway, and the first talk is going to be given by Anna on air pollution from pregnancy to 18 years, UK birth cohort.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here to present this piece of work that is done as part of the Longitudes project, looking at air pollution from pregnancy to 18 years and its association with cardiometabolic health in early adulthood. Oh.
Green one?
Yeah. I don't think it's working.
There it is.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So, air pollution, outdoor air pollution, specifically particulate matter, is the leading risk factor for the global burden of disease, and it contributes more than well-known risk factors such as high blood pressure, high BMI, and smoking. And there are many studies showing an association between air pollution and cardiovascular disease, morbidity, and mortality. And most of those studies have been carried out in adulthood, but there's fewer evidence of studies at younger ages. And most of the evidence looks at air pollution at the same time that the outcome was assessed, or a few years before this outcome assessment. And little is known about lifetime exposure to air pollution, so this exposure over a really long period of time. So the aim of this study is to assess the association between exposure to air pollution from pregnancy up to 18 years old and cardiovascular health in early adulthood. And we also wanted to explore possible sex differences because there are some studies suggesting potential sex differences in those associations and also potential sensitive periods of exposure. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to present these last 2 results, but I'm happy to discuss about them. So for this project, we used data from AUSPAC, which is a UK birth cohort, a prospective birth cohort that started in the early 90s. And we looked at 3 measures of air pollution: fine particulate matter, or PM2.5, black carbon, which is a particle of particulate matter, and nitrogen dioxide. And those exposures were estimated using European maps as part of the ELAPS project, and those were using land use regression. And those maps were for 2010, and those exposures were back extrapolated for the other years using a ratio method. And the cardiometabolic health markers were assessed in a clinic assessment of the participants, and that happened at around 18 years old. And we looked at 8 different markers of cardiometabolic health, and those were central and peripheral, systolic and diastolic blood pressure, heart rate, carotid intima media thickness, which is a marker of subclinical atherosclerosis, pulse wave velocity, and augmentation index, which are markers of arterial stiffness. And to assess this lifetime exposure to air pollution, we assess in two ways. So first we looked at the average exposure over time. So we just average out the yearly estimates for air pollution across this period from pregnancy up to 18 years. And we also use latent class growth analysis, which is a modeling approach to model trajectories, allowing for heterogeneity in the population. So we can identify different classes of people that follow a similar trajectory of exposure over time. And then we allowed for nonlinear relationships and tested different models to see how many classes fit best the data. And we use linear regression models adjusted for confounders defined a priori, and also sex and age. So here are the average air pollutants across this period from pregnancy, so when the index child was still in utero, up to 18 years old. And here are the trajectories that we identified for those pollutants. So following the UK trend for air pollution, we observed that all pollutants reduced over time, and then for PM2.5, we identified 4 trajectories, all of them with different levels, but following a very similar pattern of change over time. Whilst for NO2 and black carbon, we found 6 classes that fit best the data, and most of those groups had a similar trajectory of change over time with differing levels, but one of the groups with a high exposure during childhood and a faster decline over time, especially in early childhood. And just to point out that all those levels are way above the current WHO guidelines for air pollution quality. Here are the results for the association between air pollution and the different cardiometabolic health markers. And it's quite a busy slide, but it'll help you to navigate through that. So in blue, we have the estimates for the average levels of air pollution. So those are interpreted as changes in one interquartile range per each of the air pollutants. And in red, we have the different classes of air pollution. So the reference class is the class with the lowest level of exposure. So for particulate matter, so for PM2.5, we observed that both a higher average of air pollution over time and also the class that had the highest level of exposure was associated with a higher diastolic blood pressure. So both central and peripheral diastolic blood pressure. And we also found an association with lower CIMT. For NO2, we also observe a similar association of higher average level of NO2 with higher diastolic blood pressure. But for the classes, we observe associations not only with the highest level of exposure throughout the entire period, but also the class that had a higher exposure at the start of the period and had a faster decline, especially in childhood. And for black carbon, when we looked at the average of black carbon over time, we find an association with higher heart rate, but when we look at the different classes of exposure to black carbon, we find further associations with other cardiometabolic health markers. So, in summary, we looked at this lifetime exposure of air pollution from pregnancy up to 18 years old using a lifetime exposure of air pollution, and we found that this was often associated with a poorer cardiometabolic health profile at 18 years old. So especially higher diastolic and systolic blood pressure and also higher heart rate. We found that looking at the average, which is an approach that is often used in this literature, we see those associations, but we get also more information when looking into latent classes. So we're able to identify further associations when we identify these subgroups of the population. So I'll like to this work hopefully should be out as a preprint very soon, so please keep an eye out for the next month or so. And there I left the QR code if you want to learn a bit more about the Longitudes project and the work that we have been doing as part of this project. And I want to acknowledge my collaborators, my funders, the ALSPAC participants, and everyone involved in the study. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, superbly timed. Next, Chandra is going to talk to us about walking environments.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. And as mentioned, I will be presenting on the perceived neighborhood walking environment in relation to ideal cardiovascular health in a nationally representative study of the U.S. And so of great public health importance, cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of mortality globally, including in my home country in the U.S. Environmental drivers of cardiovascular risk remain understudied, although environments like neighborhoods shape the behaviors, opportunities, physical and social exposures, as well as access to resources that are known to influence cardiovascular disease risk. And so neighborhood walkability may be a particularly important environmental influence because walkability has been associated with increased physical activity, for example, and may therefore confer protection against cardiovascular disease along with its risk factors. And so urban planners consider neighborhood walkability the extent to which neighborhood design supports walking. And you can visualize the difference in the pictures to the right, where the top photo of New York City has a large sidewalk and many stores along with people, while the bottom photo has no sidewalks and not a lot of people, but many cars. And so urban planners also describe neighborhood walkability in terms of density, diversity, design, destination accessibility, and distance to transit. So in terms of methods used to investigate neighborhood walkability in relation to ideal cardiovascular health, in this particular study, we used data from the National Health Interview Survey in the U.S., which is used to monitor the health of the nation. The study design was cross-sectional, and the data were collected in 2020. The final analytic sample comprised just over 27,000 participants, and we assessed walkability through pedestrian access, including walking trails and sidewalks, walking conditions such as unsafe traffic and crime, and accessible amenities such as transit stops, shops and centers, and places for relaxation. And so ideal cardiovascular health was based on a composite of never smoking or quitting at least 12 months prior to the study interview, also BMI in the recommended range, meeting physical activity guidelines, sleep duration of 7 to 9 hours, and no dyslipidemia, hypertension, prediabetes, or diabetes. And so using multivariable logistic regression, we adjusted for your typical socio-demographic characteristics, age, sex or gender, race, ethnicity, annual household income, and marital status. We also stratified the main results by age, sex, race groups, given likely differences in neighborhood features and cardiovascular risk. And so with regard to results, given the time constraints, I will only highlight main findings. And so mean age of study characteristics of participants was just over 47 years. 51% were women. 70% were white, with the next largest racial or ethnic group being Latino at 12%. And 30% had at least a college degree. 46% reported an annual household income of at least $75,000, and 22% less than $35,000 annually. Most lived in a metropolitan area, 37% in the southern region of the country, and almost 60% reported excellent or very good health, while 13% reported fair or poor health. In terms of cardiovascular health statistics, 36% were either very short or short sleepers, 12% were current smokers, 66% were either overweight or obese, and 30% met guidelines for adequate physical activity, and ultimately only 9% of study participants were categorized as having ideal cardiovascular health. And so in terms of walking conditions like traffic making it unsafe to walk, to get you acclimated to the slide, please note that the top row of estimates represent the overall U.S. population stratified by 3 age groups: 18 to 30 years, 31 to 49 years of age, and then at least 50 years or older. We've also stratified the results by both men and women, and because environments are known to differ by race due to racial residential segregation, the same estimates are then shown stratified entirely by who identified as white, followed by Hispanic or Latino, and then in the next slide, Black, and then Asian. And so some estimates were non-estimable due to low sample size, particularly in the Asian participants. And so returning to the original slide, you see here that unsafe walking conditions due to traffic were associated with an approximately 19% lower prevalence of ideal cardiovascular health in the population overall, but also, and that population, of course, included men and women, but especially among non-Hispanic white participants. And in the next slide, also non-Hispanic Black participants at least 50 years of age. And so in terms of walking conditions like traffic making it unsafe to walk, I want to first acknowledge that the scales differ for each domain of walkability presented in this study. And so ultimately, we found a lower prevalence of ideal cardiovascular health when participants reported crime makes it unsafe to walk. And this was seen in the population overall, and especially among participants at least 50 years of age, particularly among women who identified as white. And so in terms of places within walking distance to help you relax, clear your mind, and reduce stress, we found a higher prevalence of ideal cardiovascular health when participants in the population overall reported indeed having access to places within walking distance to relax, clear their mind, and reduce stress. And especially among non-Hispanic white adults in the overall population, but also women in general, particularly non-Hispanic white women, at least 50 years of age. And also among older Hispanic or Latino groups. And in addition, also younger or middle-aged Black and Asian women. And so acknowledging the study limitations, all data were self-reported. Again, these are nationally representative data from the U.S. population used to monitor the health of the nation, and there's a large sample size, upwards of 100,000 participants per year, so all data are self-report. The study design was cross-sectional, and our metric for ideal cardiovascular health does not match exactly the newest American Heart Association's Life's Essential 8 metric because the data source, the National Health Interview Survey, does not collect data on nutrition and diet, for instance. But despite the limitations, again, this is a nationally representative study. We had a relatively large sample size, which allowed for a robust stratification by age, sex, and race, along with ethnicity. And we also had access to recently collected data and multiple features of neighborhood walkability, which included, importantly, both physical and social aspects. And in conclusion, neighborhood features including safe, walkable, and accessible amenities were associated with ideal cardiovascular health, especially among older women. And so we did not show the data, but it's very important to mention that most of the minoritized groups had a higher prevalence of not having health promoting features of neighborhood walkability, like places to relax and reduce stress. And so although more research is warranted, these are the type of findings that can inform built environment intervention targets. And so I'll end by thanking colleagues who provided technical assistance, essentially, and also thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Chandra. Lots of things in that presentation to talk about. I hope we've got time to deal with questions well. Lucienne is going to talk about neighborhood green spaces.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for introducing me. The title of my presentation is Neighborhood Green Spaces Contribute to the Maintenance of Leisure Time Physical Activity over an 80-year follow-up from ELSA Brazil. And I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Brazil. Neighborhood green spaces defined here as the amount of vegetation of public spaces, such as parks, gardens, and street trees, may provide a favorable environment for physical activity. However, some cohort studies have indicated that over time, increase in the neighborhood green spaces favors maintenance but not the initiation of physical activity. Some aspects of the environment associated with green spaces may influence the physical activity practice. Better environmental resources such as street lights and paved sidewalks may favor physical activity practice. Perceived safety in the neighborhood may encourage the use of green spaces and favor the physical activity practice. It's worth noting that the best condition of the environment depends on the highest neighborhood socioeconomic status. Therefore, in this work, we investigated if green spaces were associated with leisure time physical activity and if this association was independent of perceived safety, percentage of sidewalks and street lights, and neighborhood socioeconomic status. Our study was conducted with participants of the Brazilian Longitudinal Study of Adult Health, ELSA Brazil. ELSA Brazil is a cohort study of more than 15,000 civil servants aged 35 to 74 from 6 research centers located in 6 different states of Brazil. After excluding losses of follow-up, deaths, and missing values, the longitudinal analysis of this study included 4,800 participants from the research centers from state of Minas Gerais and São Paulo. These participants were evaluated in 3 follow-up visits in a median follow-up time of 8.2 years. Neighborhood green spaces were expressed as quintiles of mean positive values of the normalized difference vegetation index, the NDVI. Areas such as lakes, rivers, and dams, as well as interior of blocks of private buildings, were excluded from the images. Therefore, we evaluated the only values of NDVI of public spaces, as we can see in the maps on the screen. We used the images of the RapidEye satellite of 5-meter resolution in the year of 2011. The neighborhood was defined as a 500-meter circular buffer around the residence of the participant in Visit 1. Categories of frequency of moderate vigorous physical activity were practice of moderate vigorous physical activity in none of the visits as our reference category, practice of moderate vigorous physical activity in 1 or 2 visits or in 3 visits. And this last one category considered as the maintenance of physical activity in 3 visits. The data of physical activity was obtained through the International Physical Activity Questionnaire in its long version, validated for Brazilian adults using the domain of recreation, sports, and leisure time physical activity. Cover rates at individual level measured at visit 1 were sex, age, education, research center, residence in slums, and perceived safety. Cover rates at contextual level measured in a 500-meter circular buffer, which used data of 2010 population census, were percent of households with paved sidewalks, with street lights, and the neighborhood average household income per capita. We adopted the multinomial logistic regression to estimate the association. Model 1 was adjusted for sex, age, education, research center, and residence in the slums. Models 2 to 5 were adjusted for perceived safety, percentage of households with paved sidewalks, street lights, and the neighborhood average household income per capita. In Table 1, we can see the longitudinal association of neighborhood green space with physical activity in up to 3 visits. We found no association between DVI and physical activity in 1 or 2 visits. And after adjustment for individual variables, participants in both the 4th and the 5th NDVI quintiles showed 73% greater odds of physical activity in 3 visits, and the results were similar after adjustment for perceived safety. After additional adjustment for percentage of sidewalks and street lights, the 4th and the 5th quintiles of NDVI showed respectively 66 and 62% greater odds of physical activity in 3 visits. And finally, after additional adjustment for neighborhood socioeconomic status, the 4th and the 5th quintiles of NDVI showed respectively 48 and 43% greater odds of physical activity in 3 visits. Therefore, we concluded that higher green space contributed to the maintenance of physical activities over 8 years of follow-up, regardless of individual sociodemographic characteristics, the perceived safety, the percentage of paved sidewalks and street lights, and the neighborhood socioeconomic status. The results suggest that urban intervention to increase green spaces may sustain leisure time physical activity practice and contribute to reducing health-related inequalities. And finally, these results were recently published in the Journal of Urban Health. Additionally, in this article, we tested the equigenesis hypothesis, which suggests that general health benefits of green spaces are stronger for those living in the most deprived areas. However, we found no evidence of effect modification by neighborhood socioeconomic status in the association between green spaces and physical activity. These are the references. Thank you for your attention, and I would like to thank my funders.
Thank you very much. We're staying with the theme of green space, and Nick is going to talk to us about results from the UK Biobank.
Thank you. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour of some work we've been doing about the linkage between green space and health in the UK Biobank. And it's really been a collaboration mainly between myself and PhD student Chinozo Odubatu. So the UK Biobank, many of you would have heard of it. It's a study of 500,000 people. Interesting for us, we can get their geolocation at both birth and when they entered into the study. So this was important. Also, there is a gradient of how much solar radiation hits the UK from Scotland, with more radiation hitting down the bottom of the UK. And so we wanted to examine this. So I'll be talking today about green space and cancers, green space and vitamin D, green space and metabolic syndrome. So what we're really interested in is how does green space work? I think few of us would say going to a green space is going to be bad for you, but how does it actually work? Is it physical activity that is that's good for us? Or is it meeting people? Or is it something to do our biomarkers change some way? So the UK Biobank gave us the opportunity to examine some of these issues, but also look at green space in different ways. So how do you measure green space? Is it just looking at it? I can see some green space from here, but is that really green space? Or do you have to be physically active in it? Or do you just have to live nearby it? So we used a couple of measures of green space. So we could use satellite-derived, looking at green space, or we can use mapping to work out some sort of percent green space in your neighbourhood. The advantage of the UK Biobank, we also had some data on private gardens. We could tell who had private garden green space and had access to it. Our outcomes are probably a little less esoteric as the green space. We can things such as cancer, we can look at cancer registries, we can take a blood sample to look at vitamin D, and metabolic syndrome we can put together by using blood samples for things like whether people have diabetes or not, what their blood pressure is, all recorded at baseline. Well, this first slide here, not a huge surprise, increasing amount of green space, we're seeing greater vitamin D. So it makes sense that if there's lovely parks and gardens around you, or you have a garden, you're going to have high vitamin D, you're going to be outside, and the chance of you having sun exposure is going to increase. And this is done at a 1,000 metre buffer or 300 metre buffer, so nearby to your house or a little further away from your house. But the interesting thing here, once you get to about 60% green space, it sort of drops off. So it's good to get outside more if you don't have that large amount of green space. So then we decided to look at obesity-related cancers. So the cancers we've got listed here, there's some sort of connection to obesity. And why is that important? Well, if you're going out into green space, potentially you're going to be exercising more. So your risk of obesity might be reduced. So that's that complex interplay between green space and physical activity. We sort of recorded these both with and without prostate, because that's still a little bit controversial, where the prostate cancers are actually obesity related. And we can see a few of them, you know, maybe breast cancer here. We can see on this column here, we've got we're looking particularly at the private residential gardens, maybe breast cancer, maybe some of the uterine cancers. So note there that maybe females may be different from men. But while, you know, there's no real clear signal here, and I can't put my hand on my heart and say there's definitely something going on there. One thing though, it does seem to be on this side of the ledger. But remember, this is a large cohort with 500,000 people. So we're looking at a lot of people here. So we have to be very careful how we interpret some of these results. And this is sort of another way of looking at it. We can see with those cancers, such as uterine cancers, breast cancer, and overall obesity-related cancers, something in particular seems to be going on in the private residential garden. Now, this is a little bit surprising to us because you wouldn't go jogging around your garden unless you had a very big garden. Maybe it's something to do with gardening. Having said this, I wanted to remind the audience as well, we do adjust for social economic status. So obviously people with more money tend to live in green leafy areas and have bigger gardens. So this is something that we have to take into account. Whether we've adjusted for that appropriately, we're still doing some research on. Another factor that we're able to look at in this study looking at the obesity-related cancers, we sort of did a mediation analysis, and we saw that, you know, potentially vitamin D might be part of this story, PM2.5 and NO2 might be mediating some of this as well. So if you're in areas with large green space, you might see there might be a reduction in these. This might be part of the story. But already I'm painting a very complex picture. There's a lot of moving parts in this, so it's very hard as an epidemiologist to pull some of these apart. Fortunately, with large numbers, potentially we can do some stratification. Another factor we're interested in is metabolic syndrome. So this is sort of a hodgepodge of factors that were measured at baseline. And this is sort of a word of warning a little bit. One green space measure, we didn't really see any linkage to metabolic syndrome. But when we used some of the satellite data, we're definitely starting to see a signal. So is this real? What is the difference between these? One's a mapping, one's a satellite. So this has got us thinking, how do we choose which is the right one? So really, I think a lot of studies in this area might be thwarted in some way in the measure of green space. And remember, just because you live in a green leafy area doesn't mean you exercise more. So knowing more about the people and their exercise patterns. And we've been exploring this a little bit in UK Biobank because they do ask about physical activity and they do ask about things like gardening as well. Interestingly, we found vitamin D was part of the story around, there was some mediation from vitamin D in metabolic syndrome. We actually, in the UK Biobank, we had some information on when people worked. So there was people who did shift work during the day, there's people who did shift work day and night, and there's people who exclusively did shift work at night. Now, it's been known for a long time, metabolic syndrome and people who work night shifts, that there's a linkage between those. But what we've found was, and we found that as well, so that was quite heartening to see a well-established risk of working night shift. But what we did find, we assumed that working a night shift, you'd have lower vitamin D because you're active in your workplace at night. It was actually counterfactual. People who had day shift or indeed didn't have shift work had lower amounts of vitamin D than those working night shift. So even though metabolic syndrome was higher in the night shift workers, it wasn't higher. Vitamin D didn't seem to be part of that story, which lots of people assume. We've got a theory that maybe you come home from your night shift at 6 in the morning, sleep till 2, you go and pick up the kids from school, take them off to the park for a while, and then you go off to work at 8 o'clock at night. So you might actually be getting more vitamin D than those people that are locked, like me, locked inside an office looking at a computer all day. So there's a lot to unpick. So this is a fantastic database. We've been really excited. Some of these are out for review at the moment and should be published soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the last of the presentations in this section of the morning is going to be given by Ariane, who's going to talk about exposure to oil spills.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'll be speaking on maternal exposure to an oil spill and children's mental health, the mediating role of mother's resource loss. So by way of background to this study, in April of 2010, the BP Deepwater Horizon drilling rig exploded off the coast of Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico, spilling 200 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf over the next 3 months. The physical and mental health effects of oil spills on surrounding communities have been well documented. Our own research has shown high prevalence of poor mental health outcomes, including depressive symptoms and mental distress that are associated with exposure to the oil spill. And we have, though, fewer studies that have focused specifically on children's mental health. Because children are a particularly vulnerable population after disasters, and they are embedded in families that can influence their ability to cope with disasters, they're particularly vulnerable and particularly important for us to study. So the hypothesis of our study is that mothers who are exposed to an oil spill experience subsequent resource loss, which then negatively impacts their children's mental health. The objectives were to assess the effect of mothers' exposure to the BP oil spill on their children's mental health and to determine whether mothers' perceived loss of resources is mediating this relationship. So the data for this study come from the Women and Their Children's Health Study, or the WATCH study. We began collecting data on women and their children in southern Louisiana in 2012 after the occurrence of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. We're currently in the middle of the third wave of data collection, but for this analysis we're using data from waves 1 and 2, where we had 457 mothers and 457 children who had complete data. So children's mental health is the outcome for this study. We measured it using an interview-administered strengths and difficulties questionnaire at wave 2 of the study. The questionnaire contains 20 items covering things like emotional symptoms, conduct problems, hyperactivity and attention, and peer problems. We used confirmatory factor analysis to create an overall total difficulty score and summed the items so that higher values are indicative of greater difficulties. So then the exposure for this study was maternal exposure to the oil spill, which we collected at Wave 1 in 2012. And we, again, in our previous work, used confirmatory factor analysis to identify kind of two components of exposure. So physical exposure consisted of 5 items of things like, having less access to recreational areas in their communities, or the oil spill damaged their property. We also had economic exposure, 3 items, which had to do with things like loss of income or job as a result of the oil spill. And then we also hypothesized that mother's resource loss mediates the effect of the oil spill on the mental health of their children. So in other words, being exposed to the oil spill in the community would lead to maternal resource loss, which would negatively impact children's mental health. So the oil spill would indirectly impact children's mental health. So mother's resource loss was measured using the Conservation of Resources Evaluation Instrument, self-reported questions. Women were asked at Wave 2 whether they experienced any of these different types of resource loss, and they were grouped into kind of 2 categories: social and health resource losses and financial resource losses. So for our analysis, we describe our sample participants, and then we performed structural equation modeling in M+. So we first created measurement models for mother's oil spill exposure and resource loss and children's mental health, which I don't really have time to show you, but I will, however, show you the final structural model. So this is our sample here. We had 457 mothers who each had 1 participating child. The mean age of the mothers at Wave 1 was 42 years, and the mean age of our children was 13 years. 50% of our sample was white, 43% black. 58% of the sample had a high school diploma, with another 33% having college education or higher. 42% of the sample had an annual household income under $40,000 US, and about 66% of the sample was married or living with a partner, and about the same amount were employed at the time. So this is our final structural equation model, which did have adequate fit according to our fit statistics. You can see here that the direct effect of oil spill exposure on children's mental health is not significant. Those are the estimates in the green bar. But the indirect effect of oil spill exposure on children's mental health through maternal resource loss is significant in the expected directions. In other words, greater maternal exposure to the oil spill leads to greater maternal resource loss, which then negatively impacts children's mental health. So in conclusion, women's greater oil spill exposure is associated with greater resource loss, which is associated with worse mental health in their children. So this suggests that children's mental health is not directly impacted by exposure to the oil spill, but rather indirectly impacted when that exposure leads to their mother's loss of resources. So these results are generally consistent with literature showing that children's mental health is affected by the impact on their parents and their family environment. Our future directions in this line of work include exploring more specific pathways post-maternal resource loss, such as parenting styles, parent mental health, connectedness, and family environment that may have been a result of the oil spill or other disasters. Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, now we've got we've got plenty of time for questions because all the speakers have kept to their allotted period. Thank you very much. We can spend 10 minutes, I think, on questions at least. Can I just get, I'm just locating the microphone. So there'll be a circulating microphone. If you could just put your hand up. And I'll just note we have some people down the front who would like to ask questions.
Thanks so much, panel. It was an amazing presentation. My name is Gerard Finnegan from Health and Emergencies. I've 3 questions, if that's okay. One to Anna. Anna, we know that particulate matter and other pollutants can vary significantly between households based on topography, different climatological factors. Did you try to do or think about any in situ measurements to validate what your findings were when you averaged those numbers out? Thank you. One for Nick, really fantastic, Nick, thanks. I was wondering whether you tried to look at an acuity or severity or graduation scale for the different participants when you looked at either their serum vitamin D or their metabolic syndrome when you did your comparison. Thank you. Ariane, amazing, really fantastic piece of research, thanks. I was wondering whether or not you had any thoughts on whether the participants used mediating strategies or coping strategies that were different across the cohort that may have helped them deal with that loss, and that may be a confounder within the study. Thanks everyone.
So thank you very much for your question. So unfortunately, we don't have any indoor measurements of PM2.5. We are using those European maps that have a resolution of 100 meters. So those were linked to the geocoded addresses to the participants. So we have some differences across the different areas, but unfortunately, we can't really validate those findings using more precise measurements of air pollution. And also we know that the outdoor exposure doesn't really represent the personal exposure of air pollution as well. So what we try to do, this work is part of an European project that we have different partners in different countries as well. So what we are trying to do is looking at the consistency of those findings across different countries as well that have different levels of pollution and also a different confounding structure of those air pollutants.
Just to answer very quickly, it was a binary outcome, so you either had metabolic syndrome or you didn't. But of course, the things that make up metabolic syndrome, like blood pressure, etc., are continuous. So they could be looked at as a continuous variable.
Okay, so you asked about potential coping strategies of the children. So we didn't have that data in this study. I think that's a really important further next step. We do have a sub-study kind of in progress where they are looking at the children, the most resilient children and the least resilient children, and it's more of a qualitative investigation to kind of get at some of those things that I think would better answer your question. I have thoughts and opinions about what might have been going on, but it's not necessarily backed up by the data. But certainly family support, connectedness with schools and their environment, I think would all sort of play a big role in that, as well as mother's mental health and the children's own mental health.
Thank you. Excellent. You've got the microphone.
Hi. Thank you to all the speakers for wonderful talks. My name is Rachni Nagrani and I'm from Leibniz Institute for Prevention Research and Epidemiology. So I have 2 questions. My first question is for Anna. I understood that you used the ELAPS model, and this model, if I correctly understand, was until 2014 that the air pollution measures were available until that time. So I want to ask, considering the current scenario that we've now been 10 years away already, what would be the association now considering the present air pollution measures? Did you do some kind of prediction modeling that have the air pollution measurements already reached these WHO recommended levels in these 10 years? And if not, how has this affected the health outcomes that you assessed? And my second question is to Nicholas. You mentioned about the green spaces and its association with health outcomes using the mechanism for vitamin D. May I know if you assessed also other mechanisms, for example, via air pollution, and did you check what was the mediation with respect to air pollution or with other, maybe the green spaces improves the mental health and well-being and therefore may improve the physical health outcomes. So did you have the chance to even look at those mediation factors? Thank you.
So thank you very much. So even though the maps were for 2010, we had conversion factors and we were able to back extrapolate for the other years, so then we can reflect back to those levels of exposure up to the start of the study, which was 1991 until the 18 years old. In relation to the trends in reduction in air pollution and whether that still has an effect. So what we are observing as part of not just this piece of work, but as the project overall, is that we see associations of poorer cardiometabolic health profiles, even at very low levels of air pollution. So in countries like Finland, for example, where levels of air pollution are very low, we still see some negative effects, not just with cardiometabolic health, but also like birth outcomes and several other outcomes. So even though there's this decreasing trend in air pollution, we still have these effects, and now we're trying to investigate a bit more on the mechanisms. So what exactly is other pathways explaining those associations?
Yes, some people have hypothesised that having green space, things like trees, may reduce your exposure to air pollution. So we had some air pollution variables that we could play around with. We adjusted for things like PM2.5, NO2, and we did, it did change factors, probably the mediation maybe around about 10% sometimes. As for mental health, we didn't really go down the mental health route. We stuck with the registry, the cancer registry in this particular work. Others have looked at mental health and well-being. I was sort of more concerned, because we had such an esoteric kind of exposure around green space, I really wanted to have some firm health outcomes to try and strengthen the epidemiological connections. If you've got a nebulous kind of exposure and then a nebulous outcome, like what exactly is well-being and mental health, sometimes I think it can lead to epidemiological issues.
Thank you. Just so that we make sure that as many people as possible get to ask a question, can I just ask that you just ask one question?
Okay. Okay. So my name is Jean-Philippe Impana from the National Institute of Medical Research in Paris, France. So I have one question for Anna. As you rightly mentioned, carotid IMT is a risk marker for CVD, so I was a bit surprised to see the inverse association between your exposure and lower level of IMT. I had another question, but...
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so indeed, this was a surprising finding, because if we were to expect any associations, we would expect in the positive side, so higher CIMT. But on the other hand, as we are working with a young population, CIMT at this age can not necessarily, because at later ages we know is a good indicator of atherosclerosis, and there's some previous work done also in Auspach showing that there are some variations across these age. So in younger ages, maybe it's not really showing as a marker of atherosclerosis, but we are looking into more detail in that as well. And we did some sensitivity analysis to look at potential residual confounding, and yeah, so that's kind of a surprising finding for us.
Thank you for picking that up. Next question.
Hi, I'm Ching Yang and I'm from University of Bristol, and my question is direct to Professor Osborne. And just to ask you about looking at UK Biobank, but as we know, UK Biobank has been a very affluent population, so obviously people could be more green space and more access to healthcare. So I was wondering whether you've done any sensitivity analysis to look at what happens when you adjust for selection bias. Thank you.
Yeah, we did do that, and obviously it was pretty front of mind for us that higher SES people have better health, but they also have better access to things like green space. What we found was the benefits of green space seem to be, dependent on the disease. So for the cancers, it looks like if you're high income and get access to green space, you're going to have a bigger effect than low income people. So we're currently thinking about what that actually means. It might be access to healthcare, the way you approach healthcare. So there's lots of things wound up in that. So that's for the cancers, but some of the other outcomes, maybe around well-being that we've had a look at, it seems that you get a greater effect in the low socioeconomic quartiles. And we think that might be just because they don't have that access, or the access they get, it's almost like by accident that they're getting this extra physical activity. It does seem to have a greater effect in lower socioeconomic. So it really depends on what disease you're talking about.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for 2 or 3 more questions, depending on how concise people can be. We've got one here and one up the back, and somebody at the front as well.
Hi, good morning. My name is Gisela Garcia. I'm from Cape Verde. I'm an epidemiologist. And my questions go to Chantal. When you stratified analysis by sex, gender, and race, you build the intersection variable, or you analyze it separate your stratified analysis. And just one question. Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, it wasn't clear what you were asking.
Another variable with intersectional variable, or you analyze this stratified analysis separate by sex, gender, and age?
Thank you for the question. I think I'm following what you're asking, and certainly we, in these analyses, which are preliminary, fortunately, it's a work in progress, and we indeed stratified so that we could look at, for example, non-Hispanic Black women in a certain age group. And so it's a way of looking at intersectionality to see if, of course, because we expect that the relationships could certainly differ across these groups for a number of mainly social reasons. And so indeed, these were purely stratified analyses, but they inform intersectionality.
I think we've got time for one more question. I'm sorry, but we'll need to make it concise.
Simon Chen from University College London. I have a question for Anna. A very nice presentation. I noticed that you use latent class modeling. So, but for different pollutants, it seems that you classify them into different classes. I'm just wondering whether you use, certain statistical criteria to classify it, or why, choose different classes for different pollutants.
Yeah, so we tested, thank you for the question, we tested different models from 2 to 6 classes for all the pollutants, and then we used different criteria considering the interpretation of the classes, the entropy, so how well classified they are, and also measures of goodness of fit to decide on the number of classes. And we revisit that as well because in some cases the BIC was much lower for a model with more classes, but that would be expected as well. So then get into account the interpretation of the classes, not considering very small classes. So we used several criteria to decide on the best number of classes for each of those pollutants.
Well, look, thank you very much. I think we'd better change over because we want to give the remaining speakers a good opportunity to make their presentations. Could you join with me in thanking the 5 presenters who did a great job? And just give us a minute while we change over.
Okay, thanks everyone for staying with us, and we have a very lovely discussion on the first part, and now we proceed with our second part. In the second part, we have 4 speakers with 3 speakers in person, and we do have a recorded presentation. So the first speaker will be Yang Qianjiang from the Nanjing Medical University, and her talk will be for the Association of Maternal and Paternal Multiple Metals Exposure with the in vitro fertilization outcomes. Welcome.
Hello everyone. My name is Yang Qianjiang from the School of Public Health, Nanjing Medical University. It is a great pleasure here to share our recent work on the associations of maternal and paternal multiple metals exposure with in vitro fertilization outcomes. Heavy metals are common environmental polluts. Long-term, even in a small amount exposure can also damage the reproductive systems of both male and females and then cause infertility. Since 1978, assisted reproductive technology is widely used to treat infertility. This picture shows the in vitro fertilization process, including the oocyte pickup, fertilization, embryo transfer, and pregnancy test. This helps us to monitor the indicators of the oocyte and embryos, as well as early pregnancy outcomes. So the IVF cycles give us a unique chance to investigate the effects of environmental pushing on the pregnancy outcomes, especially for the clinical loss and preclinical loss. Previous studies indicate that maternal exposure to multi-metals was associated with adverse IV outcomes. However, the effect of paternal exposure is limited. Also, the combined effect of the multi-metal exposure on IVF outcome is scarce. Our present study was aimed to investigate the association between maternal and paternal exposure to multi-metal exposures and adverse IVF outcomes. Our study is part of the Jiangsu birth cohort. A prospective study includes both the ART conceived couples and the natural conceived couples. Our study involved 1804 couples who began their first IVF treatment from the 2015 to 2018. The present status, ART conceived couples were recruited before the ART treatment. The urine samples, questionnaires, and clinical information were collected at the recruitment. Then we follow up the couples throughout the IVF treatments. For women who became pregnant, we further follow up during the pregnancies. Demographic, economic characteristics, lifestyles, and medical histories were collected using the face-to-face questionnaires. Clinical information, including the infertility diagnosis, ART treatment factors, and pregnancy outcomes, were abundant from the medical records. The urine levels of 23 mentors were measured using the ICP mass. We also collected the urinary dilution for the specific gravity. The IVF outcome we assessed, including the oocytes and embryo indicates, such as retrieved oocytes, M2 oocytes, 2 pronuclear zygotes, good quality embryos, and the pregnancy outcome, including the implantation failing, biochemical pregnancy loss, clinical pregnancy loss, and live birth. Here I'll show our major results. We use a multivariable person regulation to investigate the individual mental exposure and the IVF outcomes. We found that maternal exposure to specific mentors like cobalt, chromium, and mercury was negatively associated with the number of retrieved and qualified oocytes, M2 oocytes, 2 pronuclear zygotes, and good quality embryos. Also, we found paternal exposure to chromium were negatively associated with 2 pronuclear zygotes and the good quality embryos. Then we further investigated the individual mental exposure with pregnancy outcomes. We found that maternal exposure to chromium and lead were associated with the increased risk of implantation failing, and the paternal exposure to the chromium and further were associated with increased risk of clinical pregnancy loss. Also, both the maternal and the paternal exposure to chromium were associated, and the maternal copper was associated with low live birth. Then we use a method called contology computation to explore the multiple mental exposure and the IVF outcome. We found that maternal exposure to multiple mental exposure was associated with poor oocyte and embryo indicates. Also, we found that maternal mental exposure was negatively associated with live birth. In summary, we found that maternal and paternal mental exposure were linked to poor IVF outcomes. Also, maternal exposure to multiple mentors were associated with the low live birth rates. Then we think we need, our study suggests that reducing the toxic mental exposure may improve live birth rates in IVF treatments. And I think further research are needed to explore the potential biological mechanism. I'd like to take a moment to thank our great team. And finally, thank all for listening.
Thank you, Yang Tian. Very good timing. And the next presentation will be a recorded one from Yusuf Oholt from the United States, the Econ School of Medicine. And the title of his talk is Fine Outdoor Particulate Matter and Behavioral Problems in School-Aged Children in Ghana. Could we have the video, please? Thank you.
Everybody, I am Youssef Ulhot. I'm an epidemiologist at the ICANN School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. First of all, I apologize for not being there with you. I would have hoped to be there, but it's a little bit my fault because I applied for my visa a little bit late because I was out of the country for another conference, but also of randomness that made me born in a country where we need a visa to go almost everywhere. So I'm gonna talk today about some of the work we're conducting in Accra in Ghana. It's an overall holistic project aiming at looking at child development, but I'm gonna present on the associations of PM 2.5 levels in Accra and child behavior. So we all know that air pollution is bad, basically with a wide range of health effects, etc. But most importantly for us today as an international society is that actually 92% of deaths occur in low and middle income countries. And one of the populations that are most affected are children actually. And we have about 9 million premature deaths attributable to air pollution, which is about 16% of all deaths in the world. Now, when you look at air pollution levels, they are not evenly distributed. Actually, we have 95% of the world's population living in areas that exceed the all WHO guideline for PM 2.5, which was 10 microgram per cubic meter. Now it's 5, so we have even a higher rate or percentage of population living in these areas. But when you look with me, actually most of these populations live basically in Africa and Southeastern Asia and also in the Middle East. So a lot of studies have been done on air pollution, and we have a great deal of data and evidence about the effects on COPD, diabetes, ischemic heart disease, lung cancer, with their contribution actually to and the attributable deaths to air pollution range somewhere between 11% from stroke deaths and 41%. But one of the health outcomes that have not been thoroughly investigated, especially in low and middle income countries, is actually the effects of air pollution on nervous system, especially in the kids. Mainly in high income countries or industrialized countries, we have good evidence about effects of air pollution on decreased cognitive function, autism spectrum disorder with more than 12 studies, mainly in the US and Europe, ADHD, dementia, and also some studies that looked at imaging and found actually reductions in cerebral white matter, cortical gray matter, and basal ganglia. The effects of air pollution on the brain are actually mechanistically well documented in some experimental studies that goes from direct deposition through the olfactory bulb or actually through inflammation and then inflammatory factors going through the blood-brain barrier or other mechanistic pathways like epigenetic mechanisms or metabolic pathways. Having said that, there is no study that has been conducted in sub-Saharan Africa as of today, or at least as to our knowledge. That raises the question of what are the health effects of air pollutants on the brain development of the kids that are growing right now in sub-Saharan Africa. There are very scarce data on both air pollution levels and their link to developmental outcomes. Now, when you look at this, sorry, maybe I cannot go back, but I'll tell you like this. So in Africa, in the coming years, starting 2035 up to 2050, we're gonna witness for the first time that actually the population of working age people will be actually higher than the population of the people that they need to care for. This is gonna be the first time in the African history that we're gonna be enough people at an age of working and development, and the African Union is emphasizing that period because it's supposed to be the golden age of Africa, basically. Now, the kids that are supposed to be working at that age are already born today, and their brain development has been highly impacted by pollutants in Africa. I'm not only talking about air pollution, but many other pollutants. We have high levels of heavy metals exposure, high levels also of undernutrition, etc. So this is a work that has been done by Dr. McCoy a few years ago that shows actually that about a third of children in low and middle income countries are not developmentally on track. That prevalence is even higher in sub-Saharan Africa, where it reaches up to 60% in some countries. In another work of colleagues, actually, they show that about 3.33 billions of GDP losses are attributable to air pollution in Ethiopia, and about, let's say, 2 billion IQ points are lost to exposures to air pollution in sub-Saharan Africa. However, this work actually was based on exposure response modeling from Southern California, where the range of PM2.5 fine air pollutants was between 2 to 25. Okay, the estimated slope actually was about 0.6 IQ points lost for every 1 unit increase in PM2.5 until 25, and then there is no loss, which is not the case actually in our countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So that was the rationale for developing this study, the Accra School Health and Environmental Study. It's mainly a data platform to study traditional and emerging environmental concerns in sub-Saharan Africa cities. We enrolled about 90 primary schools. We monitored air pollution in homes and schools and noise as well. And we conducted actually an assessment of anthropometry, blood pressure, respiratory health, cognitive and behavioral assessment, and sleep quality in about 1,037 kids aged 8 to 12 years. This work is based mainly on a large body of work that has been conducted by my colleague and friend Rafael Arku and also doctoral student Abu Sidi Ali, and with monitors in 146 unique locations in Accra, and a spatio-temporal land use regression model for PM2.5, black carbon, and also nitrogen dioxide and oxides, that we have modeled all the Accra greater region to a very fine scale of 50 by 50 meters to estimate what are the air pollutant levels in those areas. We therefore conducted neuropsychological assessments in schools in Accra, where we looked at the NIH Toolbox Cognitive Battery, but also the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is a subject of my talk, where we measured emotional symptoms, hyperactivity, conduct disorders, peer relationships, and prosocial behavior. We modeled basically the associations between average yearly black carbon and PM2.5 concentrations and behavioral problems in school-age children. We used traditional multivariable mixed effect linear and logistic regression models to examine associations between these pollutants and SDQ scores, the Student Difficulty Questionnaire scores, internalizing problems and externalizing problems. And we also use structural equation modeling to take into account the factual nature of the behavioral assessment that plugs into latent factions of internalizing, externalizing problems and total difficulty scores. We also looked at effect modifications by sex. One of the first results of this study is whether the SDQ works well in a setting where it was not developed, basically. And we found that it works very well with very good indications of these latent factions of externalizing and internalizing problems, and with very good statistical indicators as shown by the comparative fit index of the items 0.9, the root mean square error that was below 0.05, and the centralized mean square residual of below 0.05. Overall, in our study, we have about 60% girls. On average, our kids were 11 years. 40% of mothers had no education or only primary school, and 76% were public schools. About 30% used solid fuel or biomass fuel for their main cooking and heating purposes, and median PM2.5 were about 34 microgram per cubic meter, which is much higher than what you would expect in countries we live in. So just to summarize our results, we found actually that black carbon and PM2.5 were associated with increases of 0.1 to 0.2 standard deviations in behavioral problem scores. Like black carbon had stronger associations, but the unit is not the same. But to summarize, basically a 1 unit increase in PM2.5 was associated with about 0.1 standard deviation increase in total behavioral problems, and usually we use 5 to 10 points 10 units increases in PM2.5, which gonna translate to a much stronger associations that we have been seen in high income countries. As a conclusion, we found that both black carbon and PM2.5 were associated with behavioral problems in school-age children. Estimates, as I said, are higher than we have seen in high-income countries. We didn't observe any effect modification by child sex, and the observed exposure-response relationship at higher levels does not support some previous data that actually showed decelerating those response relationships, whereas like the slope is stronger at lower levels and stabilizes at higher levels. That's not what we have seen. We have seen a linear dose relationship that continues to be steeper even at high doses. And we're conducting additional work on cognitive outcomes as well. That's it, and I would like to thank all our collaborators in Accra, the people, the teachers, and the wonderful research team that we have there at the University of Ghana. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We're a little bit over time, but luckily we have only 4 speakers. So our next speaker is Jenny Wixman, and her talk will be focusing on ambient PM2.5 and its associated trace metals in Johannesburg, South Africa, a health risk assessment study. Welcome.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I think the date fits perfectly. Hands up, who knows it's World Environmental Health Day today? Yeah, a couple of people. So yeah, well spotted. And then I'm giving the talk on behalf of my two students who graduated. The first author is Bohlokua Matsiani. She graduated with her MPH. And then Victoria Sikiti, she graduated with her MEC. And unfortunately, they could not be here. And I said, I will gladly stand in for them. So let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, do I have to press it? Oh. There you go. So actually the previous speaker said a lot about air pollution, so I can't really add to that. Just to say that nowadays air pollution is regarded on the same risk level as actually active smoking and also leading an unhealthy lifestyle. And just a simple act of breathing actually leads to a lot of deaths globally. And you can actually see there's also a diagram of all the health effects that's been analyzed so far. And actually we need more studies looking at the health outcomes that are indicated more in gray and not the bold text. And of course, as the previous speaker also highlighted, more studies are needed in Africa on air pollution exposure and especially health effects. So the methods is, the study site was an urban background location in Johannesburg, more specifically in the area of Buccleuch, but it's closely located next to busy highways, freeways. I don't know if you can clearly see the map. The blue dot is where the sampling site was, and the red dot is actually where the city of Johannesburg has the air quality monitoring station. And we collected filter samples manually every 6 days during October to October 2021. And we used the small Joule air pumps to collect the samples, and we weighed the filters also at our air quality lab at the University of Pretoria. Yeah, the text is a bit small, but I'll guide you through it. We conducted trace element analysis on the filters. That was done at the University of Gothenburg. And you can see the small desktop XRF instruments. The instruments are getting smaller and smaller. And then also the output you get. And then we use the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the health risk assessment methods for the health risk assessment part. And the method quantifies the non-cancer health risk by means of a hazard quotient. And that's by considering also the body weight and the breathing inhalation rates of adults, children, and infants. And you can see in the table the different body weights in inhalation rates that we applied. So we used the WHO yearly guideline value as the reference value, and we also used the less strict and less lenient South African air quality standard also as a reference level, and that's 20 micrograms per cubic meter. So it's 4 times less protective than the WHO yearly guideline. And then for the detected trace elements, 5 of them had RFC values that we can apply in the health risk assessment calculations, 2 had RFD values, and we then just converted the RFD values to RFC values. And then, of course, we also obtained ethics approval. So the results, you can see the graph. The red line is actually the WHO daily guideline for PM2.5, 15 micrograms per cubic meter. And then the green line is the South African standard. So that is less lenient, as I mentioned before. On average, the PM2.5 level was 8 micrograms per cubic meter. So that is higher than the yearly WHO guideline value, but less or below the yearly South African standard. And the daily levels were exceeded on 7 occasions during the study period, but of course it never exceeded the daily South African standard. And then we did find a seasonal differences. The levels were significantly higher during the winter period compared to the more rainy summer period. And then the average level at the city of Johannesburg, of course I mentioned that station is next to the busy highway, so of course then you would expect the level to be much higher. And that was 36 micrograms per cubic meter. And then I also tabulate the trace element results for you, but let's move on. And then people normally think, what do people's lungs look like if you breathe polluted air? So this is just a nice study I found conducted in Sao Paulo in Brazil. On the left-hand side, you can actually see it's an active smoker who also commuted on a daily basis. And then on the right-hand side, you can see someone who never smoked but commuted on a regular basis to Sao Paulo. So you can still see the anthracosis that happens in the lung. So the PM2.5 and the black carbon actually get trapped in the lung. So this is proof the biological plausibility of what can happen to you, to your lungs. And then you can see the graph indicates there was actually a pretty good correlation between the city of Johannesburg's monitoring station and that of our PM2.5 that we sampled on filters. And then the table indicates the hazard ratios that we actually observed. So you can actually see for infants the hazard ratios were the highest compared to children, compared to adults. So this really illustrates that young kids are more vulnerable to air pollution effects. And then, of course, it's also got to do with the development. The bodies are still developing. Their inhalation rate is higher. They're also perhaps more outdoors than adults. And then, in conclusion, the study is the first to report on PM2.5 and some of its chemical composition in the city of Johannesburg. And the results can definitely be applied in the City of Johannesburg Air Quality Management Plan, which as we speak, there was a call out to update the plan. So the results can definitely be applied in that. Some limitations, our study was quite short, only 12 months, and we did not sample every single day. But even when people do the air quality management plans, they actually sample for 2 weeks in winter and 2 weeks in summer. So our study is a bit longer period than what's normally needed for the air quality management plans. And definitely more research, more sampling sites are needed in Johannesburg. And not just Johannesburg, literally citywide, countrywide, we need more of that. And then the take-home message is definitely our national policies need to try to bring the air quality standards closer to that of the WHO in order to protect public health. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for the nice talk. Last but not least, we have Jana Tauko to talk about the gender differences in work-family conflict and the mental health of Swedish workers by childcare responsibilities, findings from the SLOSH cohort study.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. In today's presentation, I'll be discussing some findings from our study, which examined gender differences in work-family conflict and mental health by childcare responsibilities in Swedish workers. I'd like to start by thanking Associate Professor Linda Magnusson Hansen from the Stress Research Institute at Stockholm University, who facilitated the access to the data which made this research project possible. In Sweden, gender equality has long been a fundamental constitutional norm with comprehensive policy frameworks in place since the early 1970s, so that's well over 50 years. Progressive family-friendly policies, including generous parental leave, subsidised childcare, and flexible work time for children, were aimed at supporting families to combine work, paid work, and children, and actively promote gender, social, and economic equality in Sweden. So due to these active, progressive, family-friendly policies over this 50 years or so, Sweden has achieved a high labour force participation rate for women, with near parity in employment between men and women. And the Gender Equality Index consistently places Sweden at the top in the EU, excelling with respect to equal access to employment and favourable working conditions for both men and women. However, the increasing presence of women in the workforce hasn't been without challenges for both men and women, particularly in balancing paid and unpaid work, looking after children, and all this has had an impact on mental health of parents. To examine this, we used 3 waves of the biennial Swedish longitudinal occupational survey of health, or SLOSH as it's known, from 2014 to 2018. We identified just over 14,500 working age adults with data for at least 2 waves of data with no major depressive symptoms at baseline. Those with only 1 wave of data were excluded, because then it wouldn't have been possible to calculate changes in work-family conflict and depressive symptoms with only 1 wave. And we excluded a further 6% due to missing data. So the final analytic sample was 10,065 workers who participated in an average of 2.8 waves, with 75% of participants contributing data for all 3 waves. We measured work-family conflict exposures. The work-family conflict scale actually incorporates 2 constructs or domains to measure interference between work and personal and/or family life. The work-to-family conflict domain measures the interference or conflict arising from work onto family, and the family-to-work conflict domain measures the conflict arising from personal and/or family life onto work. Participants responded to 4 items assessing work to family and 3 items assessing family to work conflict on a 5-point Likert scale, and mean scores were calculated for each work-family conflict subscale, with higher scores indicating greater conflict. The mental health outcome, depressive symptoms, was assessed using the brief version Hopkins symptoms checklist called depression scales, quite a mouthful. Responses to 6 questions assessing the degree to which respondents were bothered in the past week by psychological symptoms, including depression and anxiety, ranging from 0, not at all, to 4, very much, were summed, resulting in a score from 0 to 24, with higher scores indicative of poorer mental health. In the final study sample, there were just under 6,000 women and over 4,000 men. Most were aged between 35 and 64, were born in Sweden, in higher level occupational positions, in higher income quintiles, in a relationship, and had good health overall. 84% worked at least 20 hours a week, with 11% working more than 40 hours. 42% did 1 to 10 hours of housework a week, and a quarter of the participants had at least 1 child younger than 12 in the house, and almost half had children aged 19 or under at home. 62% of females and 60% of males did not have any child caring responsibilities. Then almost a third of females and males cared for children between 1 and 10 hours a week, and just under 10% cared for children 11 hours or more a week. Longitudinal linear fixed effects regression models were used to estimate within-person changes in depressive symptoms in relation to changes in both work-family conflict and family-work conflict exposures. We found there was strong evidence of effect modification by both sex and child caring intensity, hence we stratified models by both variables. Both females and males experienced increased depressive symptoms with increase in work-family and family-work conflict, with women being more affected, and the intensity of child caring responsibilities further accentuating associations for women. Notably for males, associations between family work conflict and depressive symptoms were strongest for those reporting caring for children 11 hours or more a week. We repeated the analysis to include general health, because general health as an additional confounder in our models. There was some contention whether we should or shouldn't because of concerns that it may be a mediator or even a collider. So we just did some additional sensitivity analysis. You can see that the effect estimates are slightly attenuated, but overall the results were unchanged. In conclusion, our study underscores the gendered impacts of work-family conflict and family-work conflict on mental health of Swedish workers, with stronger associations for women and varying on the level of childcare intensity. So these findings highlight the gendered impacts and underscore the need for policy and workplace considerations, including re-evaluation of current childcare policies, greater flexibility in work schedules, and access to high quality and equitable childcare for all parents. Also, employers should be concerned with family work conflict as a potential source of stress in the lives of their employees. So this could be a potential liability in terms of healthcare costs and even productivity. So creating a healthier balance between paid and unpaid work is important for the well-being of not only the workers in Sweden, but workers everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. So now we have plenty of time for questions, and please raise your hand and the microphone will go to you. Nick, please.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a question for Janine. Very interesting work. Very interesting to see you recorded some metals in there. Allergic asthma may be an outcome of being exposed to air pollution. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about, are the metals playing a role in there? Some have suggested that they might act as an adjuvant, somehow enhance allergenicity of other components that are out there. Mercury, I don't think featured there. We used to put mercury in vaccines. But anyway, have you thought about that area at all?
There you go. If you also look at the sulfate, we haven't mentioned the sulfate content of the PM2.5. And it's been found sulfate actually helps to dissolve the metals into the lung fluids and make them more biologically available. So definitely, metals plays a role. Our mercury was probably below detection limit. That's why we did not include it. But yeah, definitely. I don't know if I answered your question. You mentioned something else as well? Okay, lovely. But thanks for the question. But yeah, we will definitely want to analyze our samples more for nitrates, sulfates, also more of the hydrocarbons. But of course, these chemical methods are more destructive. So you have to be careful that you don't lose all your filter samples if in the end perhaps you want to use your samples also for in vitro tox studies. That we will also like to aim as well. So if there's anybody in the audience doing in vitro tox studies, I would also like to extend a welcome that you can contact me. Apologies for taking stage, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is on heavy metal exposure and IVF pregnancy outcomes. I don't know whether I didn't quite get it, but I want to know whether you had a situation and you analyzed for only maternal exposure, only paternal exposure, and the combined effect, because it's possible for the mother to be exposed and the father is not exposed. I don't know whether you separated the analysis and before you did the combined one.
We have separated through some maternal exposure and paternal exposure, and when we also have through adjusted. When we exposure the exposure of maternal, we also have adjusted the paternal exposure, and when we using the continuity computation to evaluate the combined effect, we have using the model put only the maternal exposure to 23 meters and a model for paternal exposure to 23 meters, and we also include both maternal and paternal exposure. Thank you for your question.
Thanks very much. I'm Leslie London from the University of Cape Town, and thanks to the speakers for great talks. For the two speakers, Janine and the speaker talking about Ghana, so air pollution we know is bad for us, so don't go outside. But on the other hand, going outside is good for your health. So I wonder if you've given any thought to that problem from a public health point of view. We encourage people to exercise, get outside, but if the environment outside is bad for you, what do you say? Is it a wicked problem that we can only solve by reducing air pollution?
Yeah, I think that's, you can probably do a PhD on that topic as well. But of course, I think in a place like Cape Town, I always say the air pollution is generally much lower here, definitely. So at least you have the wind, sea wind, etc. You can decide where you want to go and jog, next to the sea, the promenade, whatever. If you are in a place like Johannesburg, there's no sea. You literally have to perhaps decide where you want to jog. And Leslie, that's actually a very good question. We need more studies in South Africa with people actually carrying monitors, local sensor monitors, just to let someone jog around a lake to indicate what the air pollution levels are. And then you see always people jogging in the morning during rush hour traffic, jogging in the afternoon during rush hour traffic. And I always think, like, do these people actually know they're actually polluting, polluting themselves? So definitely we need more studies on that, and for health messages, health promotion messages as well. And yeah, of course, I mean, your indoor air pollution, we sit in a country where a lot of people, especially during winter time, they still burn polluting fuels for space heating. So then literally, I think going outside, perhaps sleeping outside, is actually better for your health than being inside. So yeah, it's a very complicated question, yeah. Yep.
I just wanted to give you a note of reassurance, that last question. There's been quite a lot of work done trying to answer that question. How bad does the air pollution have to be to counter the good effects of jogging or riding your bicycle? And the answer is it's got to be really, really bad. So there are very few occasions actually on which you're better to stay inside. The paper by Tainio and others, and John Sammett and I wrote an editorial to go along with it about 3 years ago.
Thank you, Alistair. So we have another question in the back.
Good morning. I'm Stephanie from Kintampo Health Research. And my question is to the online presenter. And who talked about the outdoor particulate matter. Maybe I missed it. I wanted to know how it was measured among the school-going children, how the PM 2.5 was measured.
Do we have the online presenter? No, sorry, the online presenter is not joining lively. So I'm sure you can find the presenter's email address online, so maybe you can directly email him to clarify this question. Thank you. We have another question here.
I work in occupational health, and we like to say that occupational health is very important to environmental health because that's where a lot of the exposures come from. But what I struggle to understand, or that we've had a bit of a disconnect, is why environmental health we measure PM 2.5 and 10, and occupational health we measure respirable, which is sort of equivalent to PM4. And even when setting OELs for occupational exposures and setting exposures in environmental arenas, there's very little connection between the two bodies of work.
Any panelists want to answer first?
I think, Leslie, do you want to take that? Because I know you also do occupational, and your group as well, they do occupational medicine health.
I can make the excuse that I don't work in air pollution.
Yeah, I think it's just literally, I think probably people working in silos. I mean, there are many people in the audience. But yeah, I think for regulatory reasons as well, one will have to go back to when the occupational laws were formulated, how were they formulated, why were they formulated the way they were formulated. So yeah. But I think the environmental field, yeah, there's no strict laws. I mean, you can probably take your country to a court to say they are polluting, but I think it's more strict in an occupational sense. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a great question. I don't think we have a perfect answer, but from the air pollution epi perspective, currently what we do mostly is ambient pollution level, which is, especially in developed countries, is very low. Now even new research projects are trying to answer how low the current guidelines should be going. So I think if you consider the magnitudes of ambient level versus some of the occupation setting is quite different. So, and also there's so many other different, I think, issues considering general public versus the occupation setting. So I think that there's a lot of differences there, but also, as you said, there should be many connections. And I know many researchers, they actually are not doing air pollution in the beginning. They actually do occupational research first, and then entering from occupational medicine to environmental medicine, environmental epidemiology. So I'm sure there's a lot of connections, but maybe this is for another talk. Thank you for the very nice comment. Do we have other questions? Wonderful. If you don't, let's give another round of applause for our presenters today. And thank you all for coming for this session, and I would like to thank to all the presenters and my co-chair, Alistair Woodward. Thank you all.